There is a specific kind of silence that only exists in one place. Not the silence of a library, not the silence of an empty church, not the silence of a house when everyone has gone to sleep. This is the silence of a $380,000 machine that was running 60 seconds ago, and isn't anymore. And if you've never sat inside a stopped combine in the middle of a cornfield during the best weather window of the entire year, watching a message appear on a screen that makes no sense the first time you read it and makes even less sense the second time, then you have never experienced the specific, suffocating, completely unreal silence that Dale Harmon experienced. On the morning of September 14th, 2021, Dale was 58 years old. He had been farming outside Escalation, Iowa his entire life. Stay with me until the end. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. He knew every acre of his land the way most people know their own name, without thinking about it, just knowing. He had 400 acres of standing corn that was ready. The yield monitor had been climbing all morning. The September sky was clear in that particular way it gets clear in Iowa in the fall. Low gold light, cool air, the kind of morning that makes you feel like the season is closing exactly the way it should. The work was worth it. It always is if you can get to the end. Dale had his hand on the header controls. He was doing what farmers do during harvest, watching, adjusting, moving forward through the standing corn in that slow, deliberate rhythm that eats acres one row at a time. And then the display changed. The combine slowed, and a message appeared on the screen. It said his machine had been flagged for unauthorized modification. It said remote operational restrictions had been applied. It said to contact an authorized John Deere service representative for review. Dale read it once, read it again, sat very still. Then the combine stopped completely. Not because of a mechanical failure, not because something broke, not because the engine quit or the header jammed or a belt snapped somewhere in the guts of the machine. The combine stopped because a company 40 miles away, sitting in a building Dale had never walked into, had reached through a software system embedded in his own equipment and turned it off, while he was sitting in it, in his own field, on a clear morning when the corn was ready and the weather was perfect, and there was not a single physical reason in the world for the machine to be anything other than running. He sat in the cab for a long time without moving. He looked at the message on the screen. He looked at the standing corn ahead of him. He looked at the harvested rows behind him, the rows the combine had already finished before the screen changed, and then he picked up his phone and called the authorized John Deere dealer in Ottawa, 40 minutes away, the same dealer he had been calling all year. He explained what the screen said. The service rep confirmed it. Yes, the system had flagged the machine. Yes, there was a record of unauthorized software modification. Yes, the restriction would stay in place until an authorized technician could inspect and clear it. Dale asked when a technician could come out. The rep said 12 to 14 days. Dale said he had 400 acres of standing corn and a 7-day weather window. The rep said he understood that was difficult. Dale said his crop would be worth $40,000 less in 14 days if it sat in the field unharvested. The rep said he was sorry. There was nothing he could do about the schedule, and Dale sat there, in the cab, in the silence, and understood something with the particular clarity that only arrives in moments of complete stillness, that the machine he had paid $380,000 for 3 years ago, the machine he had maintained carefully, the machine he had relied on through 3 full harvest seasons, was no longer had not been fully his since the moment he signed the purchase agreement. Since the moment he accepted the software licensing terms, he had read incompletely and understood partially and agreed to entirely, because there was no other option if you wanted the machine. He had bought the machine. He had not bought what the machine could do. John Deere had kept that part. Now, here is what actually triggered the lockout. Because this is where the story gets real. 6 weeks before harvest, back in late July, the combine's sensor array had been throwing fault codes since June. Not intermittent codes, persistent ones, the kind that doesn't go away on their own. Dale had called the authorized dealer in June. They couldn't schedule for 8 weeks. He called again, further out. He called a third time, same answer, 8 weeks, during the months leading into harvest. 8 weeks where the machine was throwing fault codes and the authorized dealer's answer was, "We'll get there when we get there." So Dale drove to an independent repair shop in Knoxville, Iowa, run by a man named Frank Gallo, who had been working on farm equipment for 30 years. Frank diagnosed the sensor fault in 40 minutes, fixed it in 2 hours. Charged Dale $340. The authorized dealer had quoted $1,200 for the same repair with an 8-week wait attached. The repair worked perfectly. The fault codes cleared. The combine ran clean through the remaining weeks before harvest. Dale considered the matter resolved until September 14th, until the display changed and the machine stopped, and 12 to 14 days became the answer to a question that his crop could not afford to wait on. He climbed down from the cab. He stood in the field beside the stopped combine, $380,000 of green and yellow iron sitting completely silent in the Iowa morning. And he looked at the standing corn ahead of it, and the harvested rows behind it, and the sky above it that was clear, and would stay clear for maybe 7 more days before the forecast changed. And he took out his phone. He didn't plan what he did next. He hadn't thought about it. He just did it, opened his camera and started recording, not dramatically, not with anger shaking his voice. Steadily. The way a man talks when he is describing something that happened, and he wants the description to be accurate. He pointed the camera at the combine, at the field, at the message still visible on the cab display. And he explained, in plain, specific language, exactly what had occurred. The sensor repair, the independent shop, the $340, the 8-week dealer wait, the lockout message, the 14-day service timeline, the $40,000 his standing corn would lose if the weather turned before the combine moved again. And when he finished, he looked at the camera for a moment and said, "I paid $380,000 for this machine, and I cannot use it on my own land." He stopped recording. He looked at the file on his phone. He posted it to a farming community Facebook group he had belonged to for 4 years. Then he put his phone in his pocket and stood in his field and waited. He did not know what he was waiting for. He just knew that standing still, in the middle of something this wrong, was the one thing he could not do. By noon, the video had 400 views. By the time he sat down for lunch, it had 4,000. By 3 in the afternoon, it had 40,000. And his phone was ringing with area codes he had never seen. Dale Harmon was not a man who had ever wanted attention. He had used that Facebook group for 4 years to share planting updates and weather observations and the occasional photograph of a good yield. He had posted a 7-minute video from a cornfield as an act of documentation, not performance, not strategy, not a calculated appeal to the internet, just honest documentation. A man saying, "Here is what happened, here is what it cost me, here is the screen that stopped my machine," but the difference between honest documentation and viral content is invisible until it isn't. And by 3 in the afternoon, that difference had disappeared entirely, because the comments under the video were doing something Dale had not anticipated. They were organizing, not chaotically, not the random noise of internet arguments going nowhere, purposefully. Farmers talking to farmers in the specific shorthand of people who share a situation and recognize it immediately when they see it described accurately. Comments that said, "This happened to me last spring. I lost 2 weeks of planting." Comments that said, "My dealer told me 6 weeks for a hydraulic repair during corn planting. I had to borrow a neighbor's machine just to get in the field." Comments that said, "I have a $420,000 tractor sitting in my shed right now, waiting on an authorized technician who can't come for 3 weeks. And underneath every specific complaint was a shared understanding that what Dale had described was not an isolated incident. It was a system designed to route all repair, work through authorized channels, regardless of the farmer's circumstances or the urgency of his situation. And the remote lockout capability embedded in John Deere's equipment was the enforcement mechanism for that system. The thing that turned a policy preference into an operational reality that a farmer sitting in a stopped combine in the middle of harvest could not argue with, could not work around, could not fix with a phone call to a man in Knoxville who charged $340 instead of $200. By 6 in the evening, the video had 180,000 views, and a farmer named Curtis Webb from outside Des Moines posted in the comments that he was driving his tractor to John Deere's regional office in Moline, Illinois on Friday morning, and that anyone who wanted to join him was welcome. That comment got 340 likes in the first hour. The replies beneath it were farmers saying, "I'll be there. What time? How do we coordinate?" Dale read that comment sitting at his kitchen table, and the unease he had felt at 40,000 views deepened considerably at 180,000 views, with a convoy forming in the comments section. Because the thing he had started with a 7-minute video posted from a cornfield was becoming something larger and more organized than he had intended. And he wasn't sure if larger and more organized was the right direction. He wasn't sure if it would help his combine get unlocked or if it would harden John Deere's position and produce a legal response that a small Iowa farmer was not equipped to handle. He called his neighbor Tom Briggs. Tom farmed 600 acres adjacent to Dale's south fence line. He had the particular combination of practical judgment and calm temperament that Dale had relied on for 20 years when a situation needed a perspective that wasn't his own. Tom came over, sat at the kitchen table, watched the video, scrolled through the comments, looked at 180,000 views and said, "Dale, this is not a small thing anymore." Dale said, "I know." Tom said, "You need to decide what you want from it." Dale said, "I want my combine unlocked." Tom said, "You're going to get more than that, whether you want it or not." Dale said, "What do you mean?" Tom said, "There are farmers in 7 states talking about driving to Moline on Friday. This is not about your combine anymore. This is about every farmer who has ever sat in a stopped machine waiting on an authorized technician while his crop stood in the field." Dale looked at his phone, then out the window at the dark cornfield. Then he said, "I just wanted to harvest my corn." Tom said, "I know you did." And then Tom said something that Dale would think about many times in the weeks that followed. Tom said, "Dale, you documented everything, didn't you?" Dale said, "What do you mean?" Tom said, "The dealer calls, the repair quotes, the wait times, the Frank Gallo invoice, all of it." And Dale said, "I keep records of everything, always have. My father taught me that a farmer who doesn't document his business is a farmer who loses arguments he should win." Tom nodded slowly and said, "Then you're not as exposed as you think you are." Dale got up from the kitchen table, walked to the filing cabinet in the corner, opened the bottom drawer, pulled out a manila folder, 2 inches thick with printed emails, service invoices, dealer call logs, repair estimates. 3 years of interactions with John Deere's authorized service system, recorded with the methodical thoroughness of a Itao man who had learned from his father that the details you write down are the only details that survive a dispute. He set the folder on the kitchen table between them. Tom looked at it and said, "That's your combine back." Dale looked at the folder, at the phone showing 200,000 views, at the dark cornfield outside the window, and understood, for the first time since the display changed that morning, that the stopped combine in his field was not the end of something. It was the beginning of it. Friday morning arrived with the particular cold clarity of an Iowa September that has decided to remind you that October is coming. Dale was up at 4:30, not because an alarm told him to be, because sleep had stopped being available sometime around 2 in the morning when his phone finally stopped generating enough notifications to light the bedroom ceiling. He made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the manila folder in front of him and his phone beside it. The video had crossed 800,000 views sometime during the night, comments still arriving faster than he could read them. And he was trying to hold in his mind simultaneously the 2 things he now was, the thing he had been for 58 years, which was a farmer in Oskaloosa, Iowa, with 400 acres of standing corn and a stopped combine, and the thing he appeared to have become in the last 48 hours, which was the public face of an argument that several 100,000 people had decided they had a personal stake in. The distance between those 2 things was the widest distance Dale Harmon had ever tried to navigate, And he was doing it at 4:30 in the morning, with coffee still too hot to drink, and a folder of documents his neighbor had told him was his combine back. The convoy had organized itself with the spontaneous efficiency that angry people with a common purpose sometimes produce. By Thursday evening, confirmed participants were coming from Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Missouri. Farmers who had loaded their tractors onto flatbeds or who intended to drive them the final miles to John Deere's regional office in Moline under their own power. The logistics had been coordinated entirely through Facebook comments and a group chat that Curtis Webb had created Wednesday night. 340 members by Thursday morning. 890 members by Thursday evening. The plan was simple in the way that plans are simple when the people making them have a clear objective and no interest in complexity. Arrive at John Deere's regional office on East Moline Boulevard at 9 in the Bean. Morning, park, just park, engines off, no shouting, no organized chants. A few handwritten signs that farmers had made themselves, nothing professional, nothing produced. Just the physical presence of John Deere equipment, parked outside the building of the company that made it, by the people who paid for it. 63 machines, silent rows. The most efficient argument any of them had ever been part of. Dale drove to Moline on Thursday evening, not in a tractor, in his truck. Tom Briggs in the passenger seat, the manila folder on Tom's lap. They checked into a motel 6 miles from John Deere's regional office, and Dale sat on the edge of the bed and called his daughter Rachel in Des Moines, who had been texting him since Wednesday afternoon with a mix of genuine concern and practical advice that reminded him painfully of her mother. Rachel said, "Dad, do you have a lawyer?" Dale said, "I have Tom." Rachel said, "Tom is a corn farmer, Dad. You need an actual lawyer." Dale said, "Rachel, I have a folder of documents and 63 tractors." "I think I'm all right," Rachel said. "Please don't say anything to anyone tomorrow that you haven't thought about completely," Dale said. "I'm planning to say nothing at all." Rachel said, "That might actually be the right answer." He said goodnight. Put the phone down, stared at the ceiling, thought about the combine sitting in his field, about the standing corn around it, about the weather forecast giving him 4 more days before the system moved in from the northwest. 4 days that the authorized service timeline would not satisfy. 4 days that 63 tractors parked outside a building might, or might not, change. He fell asleep sometime after midnight, still thinking about the corn. The tractors started arriving in Moline before sunrise. Some of them had driven through the night from staging points in Wisconsin and Minnesota. By 7:30 in the morning, 38 machines were parked on the street outside John Deere's regional building. By 8:45, there were 63, and the sight of them, 63 John Deere tractors of various sizes and various ages, arranged in patient, silent rows on East Moline Boulevard in the early morning light, was something the employees arriving for work that Friday had not expected to see. They stood in the parking lot and looked, and their expressions moved between confusion and recognition and something that was either guilt or fear, depending on the individual and how close they were to the decisions that had produced the image they were looking at. One employee took a photograph from the parking lot entrance and posted it online at 8:52 in the morning. That photograph was shared 40,000 times before 9:30. It was on the Des Moines Register website by 10, on the Associated Press-wire by 10:45, on national news by noon. Not because 63 tractors is an inherently dramatic number, but because the image those 63 tractors produced, green and yellow machines, built by the company whose building they were parked outside, arranged in silence, arranged in patience, completely and utterly peaceful, was the kind of image that communicates more efficiently than any argument ever could. That image said everything about power and proportion, about what it looks like when working people who have been treated as less important than a software licensing agreement decide to make their presence felt in the only language that requires no translation, the language of showing up, of being physically present in a place designed to make you feel absent. of parking your machine outside the building and waiting with the same patience you bring to a field that needs working, steady, unhurried, and absolutely immovable. The first person to come out of the building was not an executive, not a lawyer, not a PR representative. It was a young woman named Sarah Chen. She worked in John Deere's regional customer service department. She had seen her colleague's photograph from the parking lot. She had walked to the front windows and looked at the 63 tractors on East Moline Boulevard, and she had made a decision, personal, unauthorized, and entirely her own, to walk outside and talk to the farmers, not as a company representative, not with prepared language, just as a person who had spent 3 years handling customer service calls from farmers, describing situations exactly like the one that had produced the image she had just seen. She walked out the front door at 9:15 with her employee badge still on her jacket and no script in her hand. She found Dale Harmon standing beside Tom Briggs near the front row of tractors, identifiable because Curtis Webb had posted his photo in the convoy group chat the previous evening. Sarah Chen walked up to Dale and said, "Mr. Harmon, I want you to know that I read your file and I understand what happened, and I'm sorry." Dale looked at her badge and said, "Are you authorized to say that?" Sarah Chen walked back through that front door, and Dale Harmon stood on that sidewalk with Tom Briggs beside him and said absolutely nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Both of them knew it. You don't fill silence like that with words. You just stand in it and wait and trust that what you set in motion is still moving, even when you can't see it moving. And inside that building, things were moving fast. John Deere's regional leadership had left the office Thursday evening, completely unprepared for what Friday morning would look like. They had walked out of a normal workday and walked into a situation that had already escaped every stage where it could have been handled quietly. And that is the particular quality of urgency that large organizations fear most. Not the crisis they see coming, but the one that arrives fully formed while they were still deciding whether it was real. The people inside who understood exactly how bad this was were arguing with the people who were still trying to calculate legal exposure before authorizing any response. And those arguments were flying across phone lines to John Deere headquarters in Moline at a speed and intensity that the regional office phone system had genuinely not been asked to handle in recent memory. Meanwhile, Dale's manila folder had entered the situation, not dramatically, quietly, the way the most important things always enter. Tom Briggs had spent Thursday evening scanning every single document in that folder onto his phone. Every printed email, every service invoice, every dealer call log, every repair estimate going back 3 years, and at Rachel Harmon's insistence, because Rachel is usually right, Tom had sent the complete digital file to a farm bureau, attorney named Margaret Holloway in Des Moines. Margaret reviewed the entire file Thursday night. She called Tom at 7 in the morning, and what she told him stopped him cold. She said what that folder contained was not a customer complaint. It was a documented record of systemic service failures spanning 3 full years, 14 separate interactions with John Deere's authorized dealer network, service delays averaging 47 days during planting and harvest windows, repair estimates averaging 3.4 times the rate of independent shops for identical work, and 2 separate instances where Dale had been told warranty coverage didn't apply, for repairs that independent technicians later confirmed were clearly warranty eligible. Margaret said, "Tom, this folder is not a customer complaint. This is the foundation of a class action." Tom looked at Dale across the kitchen table and said, "Rachel was right about the lawyer." Dale said, "Rachel is usually right." Tom sent Margaret's assessment straight to Curtis Webb. Curtis posted it in the convoy group chat at 7:45 in the morning. All 890 members of that chat read it, and they read it with the focused electric attention of people who have just discovered that the thing they thought was a personal grievance has a legal name, a legal architecture, and a path forward that extends well beyond 63 tractors parked on a boulevard in Moline. By 11 in the morning, 3 separate things were happening simultaneously that John Deere's regional leadership had not planned for and could not individually stop. The photograph of the 63 tractors was on every major news website in the country: Chicago, Des Moines, Minneapolis. Television stations were sending interview requests. Margaret Holloway had filed a formal legal notice directly with Deere and Company headquarters, citing Dale's 3 years of EPA documentation as the foundation for a potential class action on behalf of farmers across multiple states who had experienced the same pattern of failures. And a United States Senator from Iowa named Patricia Dolan, who sat on the Senate Agriculture Committee, had posted publicly that she was calling on John Deere to immediately restore Mr. Harmon's equipment and meet with her office to discuss the broader policy implications of remote equipment, lockout capabilities built into farm machinery. 3 things, simultaneously, at 11 in the morning on a Friday. And the convergence of those 3 things produced inside that building the specific institutional stillness that only arrives when a decision has become inevitable. When an organization has finally run out of the one thing it was depending on to avoid the decision, which was time. Dale Harmon, standing outside with his folder and his neighbor and his 4-day weather window, was the reason time had run out. The call came at 12:47 in the afternoon, not to Dale's phone. To Margaret Holloway's phone in Des Moines, John Deere's general counsel's office. They wanted to meet, that afternoon, at the regional building. Today, Tom walked over to where Dale was standing near the front row of tractors, eating a sandwich that Curtis Webb's wife had brought out in a cooler from their farm. Tom said, "Margaret got a call." Dale stopped eating and looked at him. Tom said, "John Deere's general counsel's office wants to meet, here, this afternoon." And Dale looked at the 63 tractors, at the farmers standing among them in the September light. Men and women who had driven through the night from Wisconsin and Minnesota and Missouri, who had loaded machines onto flatbeds, arranged childcare, left their own farms on a Friday in the middle of harvest season. For a farmer they had never met, because that farmer had posted a 7-minute video from a cornfield that said something true about something every one of them already knew was true, and had never heard said out loud before. With documentation attached, Dale said, "Tell Margaret yes." The meeting was at 2 in the afternoon, second-floor conference room. Dale, Tom, and Margaret on one side of the table. On the other side, John Deere's Regional Vice President Stephen Hartley, composure carefully maintained, visibly costing him something, a senior company attorney named David Park, who had driven from headquarters that morning and said very little but wrote everything down, and a customer relations director named Brian Moss, whose entire job in that room was to find a way through the meeting without giving away more than the situation absolutely required. Margaret had one instruction for Dale on the walk from the parking lot. She said, "Let me speak first. Let me establish what the documentation shows. And Dale, if they ask you a direct question, you answer it directly, completely, and without anger. Anger is the one thing that helps them and hurts us today." Margaret opened the meeting by placing Dale's complete 3-year file on the table, a stack that was visible, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. And she said, "Gentlemen, my client has 3 years of documented interactions with your authorized service network that establish a pattern of service delays, excessive pricing, and warranty denial that I believe any reasonable jury would find directly relevant to whether the remote lockout applied to his equipment on September 14th was a legitimate enforcement action, or a punitive use of software capability against a customer who sought independent repair because your authorized network had failed him." On 14 separate occasions over 3 years, she slid a printed summary to each of the 3 men across the table. And days, the average service wait time during planting and harvest windows documented in Dale's file. 3.4 times the average. Cost difference between authorized dealer estimates and independent shop invoices for identical repairs. 2 instances of wrongful warranty denial confirmed by independent technicians afterward. And then she said, "I want you to understand before this conversation goes any further. This file does not represent my client's grievance alone. It represents a pattern I'm currently in communication with more than 200 farmers about." David Park looked at the file, looked at Margaret, wrote something on his notepad, said nothing. The room went quiet. Not ordinary quiet. The specific quality of quiet that exists when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. and every person in the room is silently adjusting to the new shape of what just happened. Stephen Hartley spoke for 20 minutes, carefully, with the measured, legally calibrated language of a man who was thoroughly briefed before walking into this room. Acknowledging service failures, acknowledging that remote lockout required careful application, acknowledging strained relationships with independent farmers. Dale sat across from him and listened to all of it with the patience of a man who has spent his entire life listening to weather forecasts and commodity markets and the various practiced ways the world explains why things are the way they are. And when Hartley finished, Dale leaned slightly forward, hands folded on the table, and said, "Mr. Hartley, I have 240 acres of corn standing in my field, 4 days of weather, and a combine your system stopped on a clear morning when the crop was ready, and there was no reason in the world for it to be anything other than running. When can I get back in my field?" That question, after 20 minutes of careful corporate language, landed like a stone dropped into still water. Hartley's Moss looked at Park. Park looked at his notepad. Then Hartley said, "Mr. Harmon, your equipment restriction will be lifted before end of business today." Hartley said, "Today?" Dale nodded slowly and said, "Thank you." That was the only thing he said in that meeting that wasn't a direct answer to a direct question, because it was the only thing left that needed saying. That lesson unlocked the combine, not the boulevard, not the cameras, just the quiet, unglamorous habit of a man who wrote things down, kept what he wrote, and trusted that the truth, documented carefully enough, would always be more powerful than any system,